Everybody loves a pre-cut cake, a pre-cut cheesecake, a pre-cut pizza, and a pre-cut jelly roll. Welcome back to 3 Ways To, and today we're tackling one of my favorite pre-cut fabrics, and that is a jelly roll. Let's get into what a jelly roll is. So a jelly roll is typically 42.5-inch strips. And there are so many different jelly roll quilts and projects out there, and I wanted to go with something a little bit more unconventional, and we are gonna do some baby items. So today I'm gonna show you 3 ways to turn this jelly roll into a little goat, Lovey. Oh my gosh, how cute is that? A portable diaper changing mat, and a nice little diaper and wipe caddy. If you use your fabric very carefully with this roll, because there are pinks and blues, you can make one of each of these with each color section of the jelly rolls. First, we're starting with the portable diaper changing mat, and here is what you're gonna need. You want 13 half strips of your jelly roll. And then with the diaper changing mat, you want it to be wipeable, you want it to be waterproof. And that is why I am using, this is white Babyville PUL fabric. And on one side, there's a plastic covering so that you can easily wipe it off. You just wanna make sure to clip carefully because there will be some pull. Our first step is to get 13 half strips of your jelly roll and then lay them out the way you want and sew them together lengthwise. Next, you're gonna cut your foam using the template that is in the pattern. Yes, there is a pattern. There's a free pattern for all of these things I'm showing you today. Then I'm gonna lay down all of my strips that are sewn together, right side down. I'll spray everything with a little bit of basting spray and then put my foam piece on top, cut out around the edges of it. And now I can baste these 2 pieces together using a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And if you didn't know, sew basting just means using a longer stitch to hold down your layers together until you're officially gonna stitch it later. Now we're gonna add 2 Velcro pieces, and we want 2 1.5 strips of the hook side, so the scratchy side of the Velcro, and you wanna make sure that it is sewable, not adhesive. Adhesive will not sew well at all, and it will gum up your needle. When you place your Velcro pieces from the top of the mat, you wanna make sure that it is 14.75 of an inch down and 6 inches in from either side. Then you can sew an 1/8 of an inch around each of those pieces. Now we're placing the PUL fabric on top, and we want to make sure that the wipeable waterproof side is facing up. When clipping the PLU fabric, I like to use more clips than I normally would just because the PLU fabric is a little bit more slippery. And technically you could use pins, but I just don't want to damage the waterproof fabric by putting holes in it. Then you can sew base using an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Then if there's any extra overhang, you can cut that off, but I wouldn't feel the need to cut it off unless it was more than around an 1/8 of an inch. Your next step is to make bias binding, and I do have instructions for that in the pattern. It is a lot easier than you think. And you're really gonna bind this the same way you would a quilt, it's just a little bit curvy. Align the raw edges of the mat and the binding together, leaving around 6 inches of overhang, and sew them all around with the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then to put the final 2 pieces together, you're gonna leave around an 8 inch gap between the top and bottom piece. Then wherever the end of your first strip ends, you are going to measure out 2.5 inches because that's the width of the binding. Then you can lay your top piece of binding over that measurement, and then you're gonna cut an 1/8 of an inch less than that. And by cutting a little less than our 2.5 inch width, it's just giving us a little bit of wiggle room. Then you can open up your 2 end pieces and place them perpendicularly on top of each other. And I just wanna make sure that tip of the bottom piece is overlapping by 1/4 of an inch. Then you can pin everything in place, and then you'll sew from the top corner down to that bottom corner. Then before you cut off that excess fabric, make sure that nothing is twisted. I am queen of twisting my binding. And if everything looks good, cut off the extra and sew the rest of the binding down. Then you can fold the rest of your binding onto the PLU side of the fabric and sew it down. And here's your reminder, do not iron the PLU side because it will melt. Now we've got 2 more steps and we are finished. Our next step is to add the soft side of the Velcro to the top. To do this, you're gonna measure around 1/2 of an inch down and then around 2 inches in from that curved part.
Then you can sew on the 2 pieces of Velcro using your 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, just in a rectangle around the edges.
And your final step is using a heat erasable pen. I am just going to draw a straight line from the edge of this side to the edge of this point.
And I know I can't iron the PLU fabric, but I do know with this pen that the marks fade over time, so I'm not worried about it. After I draw a line on both sides, I am going to go sew down the line that I drew, making sure to backstitch at the beginning and end. And this last step makes folding in the wings so much easier.
And our mat is done. How easy is that? And here is how it works. You're gonna fold the little wings in, and then you're gonna fold the mat up once, 2, 3 times, and then this part comes down and hooks on. Once you fold it a couple times, it will keep its memory a little bit better, and it will be easier to fold up. And then when you need to use it, all you do is unhook it, and then you're ready to roll it back up and take it on the go. Next up, we got our goat, Lovey. How cute is this guy? Oh my goodness. With this little goat, Lovey, I wanna show you a trick that you can use with so many different projects. So for this, we're gonna create a 6x6 grid, but instead of cutting out a bunch of 2.5 inch squares, first you're gonna take 6 half strips and you're gonna sew them together lengthwise, and then you're gonna press them all to one side.
Then you can fold your 6 strips in half again lengthwise, and then sew them all together. And this will create a little tube. And now that it's in a little tube, I'm gonna cut different 2.5 inch strips out of this. And to make sure everything is straight, I just like to line up one of the lines on my ruler with one of the seam lines. Now I'm gonna create the grid by seam ripping my 6 strips in different ways. The first strip, I'm gonna seam rip in between whatever 2 blocks I want. Then for the second strip, I'm gonna look back at the first strip and notice my 2 blocks at the bottom are a sloth and a fish. And so on the second strip, I'm gonna seam rip in between the sloth and the fish. Then for the third strip, I'm gonna look back at the second, look at the bottom 2 blocks, and seam rip in between those 2 blocks. Then I'm just gonna continue that pattern with all 6 strips until I have my beautiful grid. Then I can press my seams in different directions, sew them all together, and boom, we're done. This piecing method is super fun and easy, and you can make a whole quilt out of it using a jelly roll. Now you're gonna take your finished block and you're just gonna quilt it onto batting, no backing, and then cut it down into a 12.5 inch square. We're then gonna add our borders, and we want mitered corners, so we're gonna do it a little different than normal. We're gonna start by taking one of the border pieces and putting it on top of our bottom piece, right side together, and I wanna make sure there's some overhang. Then we're gonna sew it a little bit differently. We're gonna measure 1/4 of an inch in on either side of this border strip and sew it from 1/4 of an inch in on the left to 1/4 of an inch in on the right. And then repeat that with the parallel piece, and then you can press them open. With Minky, I just like to push it open. Then repeat those same steps with the second set of borders, remembering to start and stop sewing 1/4 of an inch in from both sides. And then we can make our mitered corners. Start by folding your piece in half diagonally. Then at the tips of your diagonal pieces, you want to line up those border pieces right directly on top of each other. Then using the 45-degree angle on your ruler, line that up right with the seam line, and then the straight edge of the ruler can be lined up against that fold. And that's creating this 45-degree angle. Mark it with a heat erasable pen. Repeat those same steps on the other side, then you can sew directly on that line. Trim off the excess fabric 1/4 of an inch from that seam line, and repeat those same steps with the other corners. Quilt top is now done. We're gonna lay the backing Minky on top of the quilt top, right sides together. Then you're gonna sew around your quilt top, leaving around a 3-inch gap on one of the sides so that we can turn it later on. And if you've never used Minky before, it's gonna be a little bit stretchy, so I recommend using a walking foot. Now we gotta cut off one of the corners so that we can put the goat head into later, and I'm gonna measure down 2.5 inches from both sides of that corner, then cut from those points that I marked, and it should leave around a 3-inch gap to put that head in.
Now the blanket portion is finished, and we're gonna move it to the side while we make the goat head and arms.
For this, you'll want to print out the goat template that is in the pattern. Start by placing 2 pieces of Minky right sides together, and then place the template directly onto the back of that Minky. I like to start with the goat head, and I want to sew directly on that solid line using a shorter stitch, and anywhere there is a dotted line, just skip that. You're only going to sew on the solid lines, and make sure to leave an opening at the bottom of each piece. And when sewing a stuffed animal, you want to use a shorter stitch length, so I like a 1.8 or the shortest stitch on the little rebel so that none of that stuffing peeps through. Now I can cut everything out, and for the head, I'm going to start by cutting that dart piece at the top. Then I can tear off all the extra paper and then trim around my seam line by 1/4 of an inch. Then I can repeat this process for all of the template pieces for the goat head and body. And for the horns, I like to use just regular quilting cotton, and if you do, put some fusible interfacing onto that quilting cotton just to give those goat horns a little bit more stability. Next, we're going to take the ear and the horn pieces and we're going to turn them right side out and make sure to use something pokey to get your pointy ears. Then we're going to fold the ears in half and baste them using an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. For the horns, you're going to flip them right side out and then stuff them with just a little bit of fluff so that they hold their shape, and then you can baste them using an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance on the bottom.
If you've never made a stuffed animal before, the next part is a little bit tricky, so we're gonna do a little bit of prep.
Do you see that second picture in the pattern on the left? That's basically what we're gonna replicate with the ears and the horns. So we wanna make sure the fold of the ears are facing out, and then we're gonna place the horns in the middle and chain piece them together. Now we can open the dart on the head, and we just wanna open it up so that we can line up those two seams perfectly in the middle. Then we're gonna place the ears and the horn piece directly into that dart. You can either line everything up perfectly, but I like to just make sure that all the pieces are sticking out of that dart by 1/8 of an inch, just so I can make sure I sew them all and I don't miss anything. I like to clip each piece just to make sure everything is where I want it, and then you can sew it all together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And now here comes the fun part. We're gonna turn the head right side out and we're gonna stuff it using whatever your favorite stuffing is. You want to leave around 1 inch at the bottom that has no stuffing, and then you can just baste it closed and repeat those same steps with your arm pieces. Now I am going to overlap the arm pieces with the head piece by around 1/4 of an inch, kind of pin or clip them in place, then sew them together just to make it easier to put the head into the blanket. Next, we're gonna put our goat head and arms into that corner opening in our blanket, and I wanna make sure that the head is facing towards the quilted piece. I want my head piece and arm piece to stick out by around 1/4 of an inch, and then I can sew all those pieces together using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then you can turn everything right side out, and then to give the piece a little bit extra strength and close the opening, I'm gonna sew a 1/8 of an inch around the perimeter of the piece and then stitch in the ditch in between the quilt top piece and the border.
Our little goat is finished. Look how cute he is. I'm not gonna add a face now, but if you wanna add a face, you can do embroidery thread. I used yarn and then attached the yarn using regular black thread. Now let's get to the last product. For this diaper and wipe pouch, I want to remind you that in the link below is the pattern, and all of the measurements are in the pattern.
Start by quilting your backing, batting, and main panel piece together. And for the main panel piece, if you want to use the piecing method that I taught you a little bit earlier, you're going to want a 5x7 grid. I accidentally made mine a 5x8. Oopsies! So I'm just gonna trim those extra blocks off, and then I can trim the main panel piece down to size.
You're going to want to sew the backing, batting, and quilt top all together. Then you're going to trim your piece down to size. If you want the actual measurements, it is in the pattern.
And now we can work on side panel A, and this is gonna hold your wipes. I first took my top piece and quilted it onto some batting and cut it down to size. I'm then gonna take the lining piece and make sure that wrong side is facing up, and I'm gonna place the wipe opening template in the center 2.5 inches up from the bottom. Then I'm gonna trace around that template using a heat erasable pen. Now I can layer the lining piece and the top piece right sides together. Now we're gonna sew these two pieces together directly on that line that we drew using a shorter stitch length. Now we're gonna cut out the inside of that oval piece around 1/4 of an inch in from that seam line. I like to clip my curves just to make it easier to flip, but you don't necessarily have to. And then we're gonna flip that lining piece in through that oval that we cut out, and then you can press everything nice and flat, and do a decorative stitch 1/4 inch around the perimeter of that oval. Next, we'll add our binding to the top of side panel A, and you can use traditional binding or double fold binding. For this part, I prefer double fold binding. Then you can trim off those excess binding pieces.
Then we're going to repeat that process with the side panel B. Side panel B is going to hold all your diapers.
And be careful when you are sewing with mesh because it can get a little bit stretchy. And for side panel B, all we're going to do is attach our binding to our mesh, and I like to use double fold binding just because it's a little bit easier to sew. The last piece we got to make is our closing piece, and I'm going to start with a 3" by 6" piece of fabric. And I just ironed on some medium weight interfacing just to give it a little bit more stability. I'm going to take that piece, I'm going to fold it in half, and then I'm going to sew 1/4 inch on either side, leaving an opening at the bottom. I'm then going to trim down the corners a little bit and then flip that piece right side out, press everything down, and then sew 1/8 inch all the way around the edge. Now we're going to add the Velcro, and to add the Velcro, I'm going to take the hook side, so it's the side that is a little bit scratchy, and I'm going to place the Velcro piece 1/4 inch in from the top and then just kind of center it, then sew it down using 1/8 inch seam allowance. Now we can add the loop side of the Velcro, which is the soft side, to our main panel, and I just want to make sure that it is centered and in about 1/2 inch from the edge, and then I'll sew that down using my 1/8 inch seam allowance. And now it's time to put all of our pieces together. I want to make sure my main panel is right side facing up. Then I'll place the mesh pocket right on top of the side with the Velcro. Then on the opposite side, I'm going to center the closure piece, and I want to make sure that the Velcro is facing up. Then I can place the wipe pocket right on top of that, right sides together. I'll then clip everything down and then sew all the way around using 1/8 inch seam allowance.
We're so close to being done. All we have to do is make the straps and bind it.
Then to make the wrist strap, you can either cut a 10.5 inch strip off of that binding piece, or you can measure around your wrist to see how big you want it.
I'm not going to show you how to make the binding right now, but it's in the pattern, and I have another video on our channel on how to make binding that you can watch.
We're going to turn our little wrist strap into double fold binding by folding the raw edges into the center and then pressing that in half. And once you have your double fold binding, you can sew 1/8 inch down the open side. Then to create the wrist strap, you're going to fold that in half and then baste the edge. Put that to the side, and then we can bind our main panel piece using the traditional binding method. And before we finish off our binding, I want to flip my piece over, and I want to place my wrist strap in the center on the lining side and baste that to the edge. Then you can finish off your binding by pressing your binding out, and then you can either machine or hand sew your binding onto the opposite side. I prefer to machine sew for this project just because it's going to be used a lot more. And I just want a little bit of a stronger stitch. Then to secure the strap, I'm going to flip it up, and then I'm going to sew 1/8 inch from the edge of that piece right onto the strap, and I'm going to backstitch a couple times just so it's really secure so it won't rip out when you're swinging it around. And our final step is to flip our pockets to the opposite side and poke out our corners just a little bit, and this is done!
Look how cute this guy is. Now we can put our wipes into one side, and different brand wipes have different size lids. So if you are not using this specific brand of wipe, I'm using Pampers right now, and I did some research, and the Pampers lid size is the same size as a lot of other lids, but you can make your own template just by tracing the size of the lid of the wipes that you're using. And then you just want to tuck it into place. You can put your diapers into the other side. Then we can close it up, and we're ready to go. How fun is that? Y'all, look at all of these items that we made with just one jelly roll. They make the perfect baby gifts. And remember, if you want the patterns to all of them, they are for free in the link below. If you make any of them, make sure to tag Grace Company. We'd love to see your work. And if you want to see more fun quilting content and get free patterns, remember to like and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.